The Battle of Antietam is often referred to as America's bloodiest day. Places like Miller's Cornfield, the Bloody Lane, Burnside's Bridge, commonly known as Lower Bridge at the time of the battle. These places have forever ingrained itself into American military history and have become synonymous with the Antietam battlefield. But one of the portions of this battlefield that is often overlooked is the final assault here at Antietam. And we're going to walk in the footsteps of the 9th New York Infantry as they make this final assault, and let's see if they can break the Confederate line just outside of Sharpsburg. Now, the 9th New York, along with the rest of the 9th Corps, was encamped on the east side of the Antietam Creek. On the night of September 16th of 1862, the men would encamp behind this general area behind this ridge that you're seeing before us here. Now, come morning of September 17th, the 9th Corps would be awoken by Confederate artillery, which would have been in this general direction behind the high ground here. Now, the 9th found itself in the crosshairs of Confederate artillery, and they would suffer 14 casualties before they can even break camp on the morning of September 17th. It is said that the 9th's bright red caps and large custom banner helped the Confederate artillery kind of zero in on their position, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. Now, in mid-morning, General Burnside would launch an assault across this narrow bridge led by the 11th Connecticut. Now, defending these heights were men from the 2nd and 20th Georgia. Now, I've read that as little as 300 men were defending this high ground here, but I've also read as many as 500 were. But honestly, either way, they were tasked with holding off an entire 9th Corps of nearly 9,000 men. And you can see just how formidable a position this was. Now, Isaac Rodman's division would be assigned to find another crossing south of this location. So his division of nearly 3,000 would march in this general direction on the east side of the creek, trying to find a suitable crossing for his large force. So we've moved south, I would say about 100 yards. And if you can't see it through the foliage, Burnside's Bridge is right here. And this is one of the positions where the 2nd and 50th Georgia would have occupied. Now you can see just the vantage point that they had here. Now, one of the first attacks would have launched from this general area. The 11th Connecticut, I believe, would have been making their way along the Antietam Creek here towards Burnside Bridge. Now, you can just see from the vantage point that we have through the foliage that their flank was extremely exposed, and they just suffered horrendous casualties here. So you can just see what a few hundred men, who were fierce fighters, by the way, now you multiply their capabilities with this position, and the entire 9th Corps was essentially held at bay for a few hours just because of a couple hundred Georgians in this area. So we are making our way down the west side of the Antietam Creek. And the men of Isaac Rodman's division of the 9th Corps would have been making their way on the east side of Antietam Creek, which is the opposite bank on the camera here. And here's the Antietam Creek here. So they would have been making their way down this general direction, and they would locate a ford called Snavely's Ford. And it's about 3/4 to a mile south of Burnside Bridge. Now, once a suitable ford was located, units of Rodman's division began crossing that ford onto this side of the Antietam Creek. But there was just one issue. you had about 100 Georgians from the 50th Georgia and a handful of South Carolina sharpshooters defending this general area. So imagine being a member of the 9th New York, who is one of the first regiments to cross Snavely's Ford. They're making their way across the creek here. It doesn't look like terribly deep. The current doesn't look incredibly strong, but per accounts, this water at the time of the battle was about waist to chest deep. Now, some soldiers are taller than others, so some soldiers it was waist deep. I'm sure some soldiers it was chest deep. But remember, we're carrying black powder rifles, and if that black powder or your cartridges get wet, you're essentially useless in this fight. So these soldiers would have crossed this ford here with their rifles above their heads, cartridge boxes in the other hand, and they were under fire from Georgians and South Carolina sharpshooters from the high ground here. So it wasn't easy to cross either. Now, the 50th Georgia was torn up pretty good at South Mountain, and they were only able to muster about 100 men. So they were greatly outnumbered here. Remember, Rodman's division had about 3,000 strong. So as the 9th New York was getting ready to cross the Antietam Creek, the 51st Pennsylvania and the 51st New York were crossing Burnside's Bridge, and a combination of having forces on your flank now, running low on ammunition, and now Union forces are crossing the creek. The 50th Georgia in this location, the 2nd and 20th Georgia by Burnside's Bridge would have began pulling back, and the Union forces would have crossed in this general area and formed line of battle for the final assault here at Antietam. Okay, so we are on now what is called Branch Avenue, and we are looking east. And in this general direction, you would have had Burnside's Bridge. It's probably 200 to 300 yards in this direction here. You can't see it, but just know it's that way. Now, panning a little bit to our right, that is Snavely's Ford, or that is the general location of Snavely's Ford, and that is where we just were. So the 9th New York and the rest of the 9th Corps would reform together, and they would form a nearly mile-long battle line along this location here that you see before us. And something that's really interesting that I'm noticing physically being here is the terrain. You think that the terrain is flat just when you automatically think of a battlefield, but this terrain is undulating, has a series of dips and rises, and you can really see just how difficult it would have been to advance over. Now, Lieutenant Matthew Graham of the 9th New York would be quoted as saying, "They lost men at every step." So they're advancing in their linear formations across open field, getting hit by Confederate artillery. And also, the 9th had a distinctive war cry, and it was zoo, zoo, zoo. And that they kept going, and They kept losing men, but they kept advancing. Think about all the fighting that has taken place up until this point, and they're about to reach the outskirts of Sharpsburg, and there's only a handful of Confederate brigades defending the town of Sharpsburg. The Union is this close from finally defeating Robert E. Lee. Now, as the 9th New York continued their advance, Lieutenant Colonel Kimbrell would see a soldier holding the bottom portion of his jaw. It had been shot off, and that soldier was holding his jaw standing up, and in his free hand he was urging the regiment forward, waving them forward. And Lieutenant Colonel Kimbrell would see that soldier. He'd point at that soldier, who was part of the 9th New York, and he would turn to the rest of his regiment and he would say, "You see that? Isn't that enough to make you want to fight?" And at that moment the regiment kind of gained a little bit of steam, and they continued advancing towards their final location up this way. But that's just the realities of war. I mean, you have a soldier with his jaw shot off and his adrenaline is pumping. He hasn't really realized the situation he's in yet. He's just holding it in one hand and he's urging the regiment forward with his other hand. You know, moments later after Kimbrell said that, another soldier takes a round, solid shot to the face, and essentially that soldier doesn't exist anymore. And again, here's another brief snapshot into the horrors and reality of war that were unfolding on these fields before us here. Now, and just to kind of reorient you, this is back east towards the Burnside Bridge. So that Union advance would have essentially come through this direction here, and Sharpsburg is now behind you on the camera. Alright, so like we've been doing most of the video, we've moved, and I want to reorient you. So we are just on Branch Avenue, about 50 to 75 yards east of our current location. So the 9th New York would be assaulting straight at us here, and they would make it to this location here. Here is the monument to the 9th New York, and we are just outside the town of Sharpsburg. And I mean, I'm talking literally maybe 100 to 150 yards at the most through this wood line, and you have houses. Now, defending this area was around 600 to 800 Confederates. You had some Virginians, some South Carolinians, and some Georgians, all part of Kemper and Drayton's brigades. And they would be positioned in this area along a stone wall. And right here, you can see the monument to the 8th Connecticut, who also advanced ahead of their brigade and made it to the outskirts of Sharpsburg, and they were on the left flank of the 9th New York. So the 8th Connecticut and the 9th New York made it to this location and would partake in some rather bloody hand-to-hand combat along a stone wall here. Now the 9th would come up to this area and they would surge over that wall and essentially begin driving back the Confederate forces in this area. And as you can see, this area would become the high water mark of the Union attack here at the Battle of Antietam. Now, as the 9th New York was making their final assault to this location, they would lose 8 color bearers, and a captain by the name of Adolphe Lebert, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, of Company E, would grab the regimental colors, and he would essentially urge the men forward, shouting, "Up, damn you, forward, forward." You can sense that they were about to break through the Confederate line. They were this close. Now they're in hand-to-hand combat, and Captain Adolphe Lebert would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions here on the final attack at the Antietam battlefield. Now, unfortunately for the Union soldiers who had just trekked across this field, bleeding for literally every yard, Confederate reinforcements under the command of A.P. Hill, fresh off his victory from Harper's Ferry, and his light division would arrive on our left flank. And you would have had Confederates advancing towards this general direction where we began our attack, and essentially directly at us, or on our left flank, in an attempt to cut us off. And unfortunately for the men of the 9th, who had essentially just made it to the outskirts of Sharpsburg, really had no chance but to retreat over the very same ground they had just gained. So, A.P. Hill's division arrived just in the nick of time to save the Confederates here at Sharpsburg. The 9th had no choice but to leave this location and advance over the very same ground that they just bled for. You know, think about what was going to the minds of the soldiers. They're running. You know, they're about to be cut off, so they're hauling butt out of here. You know, you're running over your friend who's no longer living. Maybe one of your friends is still living and he's screaming for help. And now you have to make the decision. Do I help my comrade and risk being captured or becoming a casualty myself? Or am I thinking about self-preservation and I'm retreating back along with the rest of the 9th Corps back to the area of Burnside's bridge. You know, is there a right answer to that question? I don't know. I couldn't imagine being in that situation. But that was the story of the 9th New York here at Antietam. And it's interesting to know just how close the Union was to breaking Lee's line numerous times, especially on other parts of the battlefield. I hope you learned a thing or two, because as always I did, and we're going to catch you on the next one.